It was that moment when the person asking to sit in the most respected seat in our country imitated a disabled reporter, someone he outranked in privilege, power, and the capacity to fight back.
Buckle up. Meryl Streep eviscerated Donald Trump's brand of leadership in one iconic Golden Globe speech, then doubled down by roasting his overrated jab with James Corden. From dissecting his cruel mockery of a disabled reporter to flipping his insults into self-deprecating comedy, Streep weaponized wit and moral clarity to expose his bullying tactics. This wasn't just a clapback, it was a masterclass in dismantling authoritarianism with Oscar-worthy precision. Let's break down how she turned Trump's chaos into a rallying cry for dignity. Meryl Streep's critique of Donald Trump during her Golden Globes speech centered on a specific incident she deemed emblematic of his leadership style: his public mocking of a disabled reporter during the presidential campaign. Streep framed this act not merely as a personal failing, but as a consequential abuse of power with broader societal implications. By highlighting Trump's imitation of the reporter, a person she emphasized as being outranked in privilege, power, and the capacity to fight back, she underscored the inherent imbalance of power between a political figure and a member of the press. Her criticism hinged on the idea that such behavior, when normalized by someone in a position of authority, legitimizes cruelty and emboldens others to replicate it. Streep positioned this act as a moral failing, arguing that public humiliation from a leader corrodes societal norms, fostering a culture where empathy and dignity are sidelined in favor of ridicule and domination. Her remarks implicitly questioned the ethical responsibilities of leadership, suggesting that those who occupy influential roles bear a duty to model integrity rather than exploit their platform to demean others. By focusing on Trump's targeting of a vulnerable individual, she framed the incident as a microcosm of a larger pattern: the use of power to intimidate rather than uplift. Streep's critique extended beyond partisan politics, touching on universal themes of human decency and the corrosive effects of unchecked authority. She implied that such actions undermine democratic values, particularly the role of a free press in holding power accountable. As the reporter in question represented a profession she later described as essential to safeguarding transparency. Streep's speech also carried a subtle indictment of the public's complicity in normalizing such behavior. By calling attention to the instinct to humiliate displayed by Trump, she challenged audiences to reflect on the moral standards they tolerate in their leaders. Her choice to address this at an awards ceremony, a platform often reserved for apolitical celebration, elevated the urgency of her message, framing civic responsibility as inseparable from cultural discourse. Ultimately, her critique was less about partisan opposition and more about defending foundational principles of respect and accountability in public life, positioning artistic and journalistic communities as guardians of these values against authoritarian tendencies.
Disrespect invites disrespect. Violence incites violence. When the powerful use their position to bully others, we all lose. We need the principled press to hold power to account, to call them on the carpet for every outrage.
Meryl Streep's assertion that disrespect invites disrespect, violence incites violence, encapsulates her broader critique of how toxic behaviors, when normalized by those in power, perpetuate cycles of harm. By linking disrespect to violence, she frames both as forms of aggression that escalate societal discord. The phrase, "disrespect invites disrespect," suggests a reciprocal dynamic. When leaders mock or degrade others, as Trump did with the disabled reporter, they signal that such conduct is permissible, emboldening individuals and institutions to mirror similar cruelty. This creates a cultural domino effect, eroding collective norms of civility and replacing them with a tolerance for humiliation as a tool of dominance. Streep implies that leadership is not just about policy but moral example setting. When authority figures weaponize ridicule, they legitimize a race to the bottom in public discourse. The follow-up, violence incites violence, expands this idea beyond verbal abuse to encompass systemic or physical harm. Here, violence may refer not only to overt acts but also to rhetorical hostility or institutional oppression. Streep warns that when power is exercised through intimidation, it breeds resentment and retaliation, destabilizing societal trust. Her statement, "When the powerful use their position to bully others, we all lose," underscores the universality of this harm. Bullying from the top down fractures communal bonds, replacing solidarity with fear or apathy. It positions abuse of power as a collective failure, arguing that unchecked authority corrodes democracy's foundations by normalizing exploitation over empathy. Streep's closing call for a principled press to hold power to account ties these themes to institutional responsibility. By urging the media to call them on the carpet for every outrage, she positions journalism as a counterforce to authoritarian tendencies. A vigilant press, in her view, disrupts cycles of disrespect and violence by exposing abuses and demanding transparency. This aligns with her earlier emphasis on the reporter Trump, targeted symbolizing the press's role as both victim of power and essential defender of accountability. Her argument suggests that without a free and ethical media, the powerful operate in a vacuum, insulated from consequences, while societal degradation accelerates. Together, these lines reinforce her thesis. Leadership's moral failures have cascading consequences, and resistance depends on upholding institutions that prioritize dignity over domination.
Embarrassing, and it's terrifying to put the target on your forehead, and it sets you up for all sorts of attacks and armies of brown shirts and bots and worse. And the only way you can do it is to feel you have to. You have to. You don't have an option. You have to. Stand up, speak up, act up.
Meryl Streep's response to Donald Trump's overrated jab critiques the perilous dynamics of political dissent in an era marked by digital harassment and authoritarian undertones. By sarcastically embracing labels like overrated and overrated, she deflects personal attacks while exposing the triviality of such rhetoric, framing it as a distraction from substantive governance. Her reference to becoming a target for armies of brown shirts and bots invokes historical and contemporary parallels. Brown shirts alludes to fascist enforcers of the past, while bots reflects modern automated campaigns weaponized to intimidate critics. This duality underscores her warning about the convergence of old authoritarian tactics with new technologies, amplifying threats to free expression. Streep portrays the act of speaking out not as a choice but a moral imperative, emphasizing that silence in the face of systemic intimidation enables democratic erosion. Her remarks also highlight the vulnerability of public figures who challenge power, illustrating how dissent invites coordinated backlash, a tactic she implies is designed to stifle opposition. By describing the experience as embarrassing and terrifying, she humanizes the psychological toll of such attacks, contrasting it with the impersonal, mechanized nature of digital harassment. Yet, she positions this vulnerability as inseparable from civic duty, arguing that enduring such risks is necessary to safeguard principles like transparency and accountability. Streep further critiques the weaponization of executive power, particularly through platforms like Twitter, which enable leaders to punish and humiliate critics while delegitimizing institutions like the press. This, she suggests, undermines democratic norms by replacing reasoned debate with performative hostility.
How easily all of this can be ignored, and how the authority of the executive in the hands of a self-dealer can be wielded against the people and the Constitution and their Bill of Rights. The whip of the executive can, through a Twitter feed, lash and intimidate, punish and humiliate, delegitimize the press, and all the imagined enemies with spasmodic regularity and easily provoked predictability.
Meryl Streep's critique of Donald Trump's governance extends beyond immediate political disagreements, situating his actions within a broader historical and sociopolitical framework that underscores the existential risks to democracy. By invoking the term self-dealer, she casts Trump as a leader who subverts the ethical imperatives of public office for personal or partisan gain, a characterization amplified by his documented conflicts of interest, nepotistic appointments, and transactional approach to policy. This critique resonates with classical political philosophy's warnings about demagogues, figures who exploit populist sentiment and institutional loopholes to consolidate power. Streep's emphasis on the fragility of freedom echoes Hannah Arendt's analysis of totalitarianism, where the erosion of civic norms and the manipulation of truth create fertile ground for authoritarianism. Her reference to the whip of the executive, wielded via Twitter, situates Trump's rhetoric within a modern continuum of propaganda, albeit turbocharged by digital platforms that enable real-time, decentralized dissemination of hostility. Unlike the state-controlled media of 20th-century dictatorships, Trump's use of social media represents a decentralized yet equally potent form of coercion, blending public spectacle with targeted intimidation to destabilize adversaries and manipulate public perception. Streep's allusion to brown shirts and bots bridges historical fascist tactics with contemporary digital authoritarianism. The brown shirts, Nazi paramilitaries who silenced dissent through violence, symbolize the physical enforcement of ideological conformity, while bots represent their 21st century counterpart. Automated systems that flood discourse with disinformation, drown out dissent, and harass critics at scale. This duality reflects her concern that authoritarianism adapts to technological advancements, weaponizing both old and new tools to suppress opposition. The psychological impact of this convergence cannot be understated. The constant barrage of online vitriol, coupled with the threat of public shaming from the highest office, creates a chilling effect, deterring individuals, from journalists to ordinary citizens, from engaging in civic discourse. Studies on digital harassment, such as those by the Pew Research Center, corroborate this, showing that online abuse disproportionately silences marginalized voices and undermines democratic participation. Streep's portrayal of this dynamic as terrifying underscores how such tactics corrode not just political culture, but the very psyche of a nation. Her critique also interrogates the collapse of institutional guardrails meant to curb executive overreach. The Constitution and Bill of Rights, she argues, are rendered moot when leaders disregard their spirit, relying instead on a populace's passivity or complicity. Trump's attacks on the press, labeling critical outlets as enemies of the people, mirror strategies employed by authoritarian regimes to dismantle the Fourth Estate. In Hungary, for instance, Viktor Orban's consolidation of media control under crony oligarchs decimated press freedom, enabling unchecked corruption. Streep's warning about the delegitimization of the press reflects a similar trajectory, where sustained defamation of journalists primes the public to distrust factual reporting, creating an epistemological vacuum filled by conspiracy and propaganda. This erosion of shared reality exacerbates polarization, making consensus-driven governance impossible and elevating performative conflict over substantive policy. Moreover, Streep's focus on Trump's spasmodic regularity in lashing out via Twitter highlights a deliberate strategy to dominate news cycles, deflect scrutiny, and normalize outrage. By flooding the public sphere with provocations, from petty insults to baseless claims, Trump diverted attention from systemic failures, such as his administration's chaotic pandemic response or ethical scandals. This tactic, akin to Nietzsche's concept of eternal recurrence, where chaos becomes a governing principle, destabilizes democratic discourse by privileging spectacle over substance. Streep's rhetorical choice to frame this behavior as easily provoked predictability suggests a calculated chaos, designed to keep opponents perpetually off balance while galvanizing a base through perpetual grievance. Ultimately, Streep's commentary transcends Trump, serving as a manifesto for civic vigilance. Her call to recognize the fragility of freedom urges a recommitment to the principles of transparency, accountability, and empathy that underpin democracy. This includes fortifying institutions through legislative reforms, judicial independence, and robust whistleblower protections, while fostering a culture that values critical thinking and resists the normalization of abuse. Streep's invocation of quaint notions of custom, honor, and duty among.
It's amazing what they can do, isn't it? Because she is terrible. She's terrible.
I'm sure.
Maybe the local must have been like, Donald Trump was right. She is overrated. This is...
I totally agreed with him. Yeah.
Meryl Streep's playful agreement with Donald Trump's overrated label during her conversation with James Corden exemplifies her adeptness at navigating public criticism with humor and self-deprecation, transforming potential vulnerability into a display of resilience. The exchange occurs within a broader discussion about her challenging first day filming a role as the U.S. president, where she candidly recounts forgetting lines and feeling exposed under the pressure of a rewritten speech and a cavernous set. Corden jests that onlookers might have echoed Trump's critique, to which Streep responds with a breezy, "I totally agree with him," deflecting the jab through irony rather than defensiveness. This moment reveals her strategic use of wit to disarm adversarial narratives, reframing personal attacks as opportunities to highlight their absurdity. By aligning herself with Trump's insult, she subtly mocks its superficiality, suggesting that such critiques lack substantive weight and are unworthy of serious engagement. Her response also underscores a deliberate contrast between her public persona and Trump's combative style. Where Trump often retaliates against critics with hostility, Streep employs self-effacing humor to neutralize negativity, embodying a grace under pressure that reinforces her reputation as a grounded, relatable figure despite her legendary status. This approach humanizes her, emphasizing that even acclaimed artists face professional insecurities, a stark counterpoint to the hyperbole of political mudslinging. Her willingness to laugh at herself, particularly in recounting an embarrassing professional moment, disarms the stigma of imperfection, challenging the unrealistic expectations placed on public figures to project invulnerability. The interaction further reflects Streep's broader ethos of using humor as a tool of resistance. By sarcastically embracing the overrated label, she not only diminishes its power, but also critiques the culture of demeaning rhetoric that Trump's comment represents. This mirrors her long-standing advocacy for empathy and dignity in public discourse, themes central to her career choices, such as her role in **The Prom**, which champions LGBTQ+ rights and satirizes narcissism. Her quip about narcissism being hilarious, unless it's the president, referenced earlier in the conversation, ties this moment to a larger critique of leadership that prioritizes self-aggrandizement over public service. In agreeing with Trump, she indirectly highlights the pettiness of his attacks, framing them as distractions from substantive governance. Streep's response also speaks to the gendered dynamics of public scrutiny. Women in leadership or high-profile roles often face disproportionate criticism labeled as overrated or unqualified, a trope Trump has weaponized against numerous female figures. By laughing off the label, Streep subverts this sexist undertone, refusing to legitimize it with earnest rebuttal. Instead, she redirects the conversation toward shared human fallibility, fostering connection with audiences rather than polarization. Ultimately, this exchange encapsulates Streep's mastery of public narrative control. Her ability to transform criticism into comedic fodder not only shields her from the corrosive effects of negativity, but also reinforces her image as a figure of humility and integrity. In a media landscape where political and cultural divides are often inflamed by performative outrage, her choice to respond with levity and self-awareness offers a model for navigating conflict with poise. It underscores her belief in the power of art and humor to transcend divisiveness, a philosophy that aligns with her career-long commitment to storytelling that challenges authoritarianism and celebrates collective humanity. Through this lens, her agreement with Trump becomes less about concession and more about reclaiming agency, a subtle act of resistance that reaffirms her values without dignifying the detractors. Meryl Streep's unflinching critique of Donald Trump, a masterful blend of eloquence, moral clarity, and a fierce defense of democratic ideals, leaves us with a lingering question. What resonates with you most after this collision of artistry and power? Was it her piercing dissection of Trump's mockery of a disabled reporter, a stark reflection of a nation's eroded empathy? Her haunting warning that disrespect invites disrespect, violence incites violence, a prophecy of cascading harm? Or her rallying cry for a principled press, a fragile yet vital shield against authoritarian drift? We want to hear from you. Did Streep's call for dignity stir your own unease with today's discourse, or did her sharp jabs, like embracing Trump's overrated label with a wink, cut through the chaos for you? Perhaps you've seen other leaders blur the lines between power and spectacle in your own world. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We're eager to unpack this with you. And don't forget to like this post, follow along, and stay tuned for more deep dives into the voices shaping our time. Your engagement fuels this journey to spotlight truth, challenge power, and lift up figures like Streep who dare to speak out. Thanks for joining us. See you in the next one.